Boker Tov, Chanukah Sameach. Beautiful to see everyone. We are in the midst of one of the longest narratives, one of the longest stories in the Torah. It's also one of the most powerful, and it works really well on film. If you've ever seen some of the, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and they've done some animated movies about it, but it's a beautiful story. And the bigger context is it's a story about how we ended up in Mitzrayim, how we ended up as slaves in Egypt. We weren't taken from our land. We went there willingly to escape a famine in the land of Israel, which was a constant trope throughout the Torah. But it's also a story about one man, Yosef, and with God's guidance and God's strength, how he used his skill to dig himself out of the deepest pits to become one of the greatest people in the known world. Yet at the same time, it's still about family rivalry, and it's still about the relationship between him and his brothers, which again is another common trope in the Torah. So while there is so much going on here, in some ways, we've kind of seen it all before, nothing new under the sun. But the important thing, of course, is what is it trying to teach us? What can we learn from it? Now, we are going to get to a takeaway message and kind of looking at Yosef, the big picture, about his journey and his growth. And it'll be interesting. You will see a lot of commonalities between his growth and the growth of his father, his grandfather, and great-grandfather. But what I want to focus on first is something that you may have figured out is one of my favorite things to do, which is to pick up on something in the Torah, specifically a word that we have no idea what it means, and to use all the different tools from classical rabbinic to modern sources to do a little bit of, scientific mystery work. So if that's not your favorite thing, don't worry, that's not all that we're doing. But I think it's important to recognize when there are things in the Torah that initially we don't understand, to use all the tools we have to make sense of it. And the thing that we're going to discuss today is a name that was given to Yosef. We talked in previous weeks about all the different names that people get. His father Yaakov became Yisrael. Yitzchak never changed his name, which I talked about in a Dvar Torah on Shabbos. Avraham was born Avram and became Avraham. So it's a big thing all over. But typically, their names are ones that we recognize. Yaakov, from the word heel, because he held on to his brother Esav's heel when they were coming out of their mother. And then Yisrael, one who struggles, Yisar with God, and that El. So all their names can be explicated, but not the name Yosef is given, because it's not given by God, and it's not given by a fellow Jew or a fellow Israelite. It's given by Paro, by the Pharaoh. So the context in our story is that Yosef, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then he ends up in the house of Potiphar, where Potiphar's wife, who were never given her name, tries to seduce Yosef. He rebuffs her advances, and she's so furious and angry at him that she accuses him of taking advantage of her. He ends up in jail. And again, in the musical, it's one of those beautiful songs where he's in the prison and he sings, "Close every door to me," where he just thinks his life is over. But then God's gift to Yosef is his ability to interpret dreams. So he interprets dreams of these other men in prison who work for Paro, and then they get out, and then Paro has a dream and says, "Who can interpret it?" No one figures it out. And one of the people that Yosef helped in jail says, "Oh, I know a guy." Yosef gets out of jail, interprets the dreams of Paro about the famine, from the sheep or from the cows, the fat cows, the skinny cows. And there's a question: how does Paro know that Yosef is right? We don't know, but he thinks he's right and says, "Not only did you figure out my dream and I'm overjoyed, I'm going to make you the second most powerful man in all of Egypt." And this is another typical trope you may have heard of. The king wants to honor somebody, so he dresses him in fine clothes, gives him his signet ring, puts him on an animal, and parades him through the streets to celebrate him. I don't know if anyone can think of the other story where that happens, but Megillat Esther, when Achashverosh does it for Mordechai. But here, Paro is celebrating him, and one of the ways that he celebrates him is to give him a new name. And Gloria and Leonard, I am going to unmute you, and now this is where we are picking up after this whole long thing. Yosef is now dressed beautifully, free, great power, great responsibility, and Paro is about to give him a new honorific. Please, Gloria, source
And
number one.
And Paro called Joseph's name Zaphenat Paneah, and
Beautiful,
he
yeah.
gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Mitzrayim.
Thank you. There's actually several names in here, and there's stories behind all of them that we're not going in today. Who's that Potiphera, this priest who is not Jewish, and neither is Asnat. And so her name is obviously some sort of Egyptian name, but the rabbis, interpret that as well. And is this Potiphera? Is it the Potiphar whose house he worked in? There's a lot of mysteries there, but what we're going to focus on is this Tzafenat Paneach. Now, again, not everyone may be as comfortable with the Hebrew, but it's important just to peek at it for a second. So if you look in the right column with where the Hebrew is, it's the last two words on the first line, so on the far left, tzaf, not paneach. There is no other word. These words just don't exist anywhere else in the Torah. Someone will point out very, very shortly. So they don't appear like any Hebrew word either. So the easiest thing to say is that they're just not Hebrew. So, okay, so an Egyptian leader gives someone an Egyptian name. But the rabbis aren't so sure about that. And they take kind of two or three different paths in understanding what this name is. Because typically when the Torah gives us a name, think about the birth of all of Yaakov's sons. They are all given names that have some sort of meaning. Even if they're a play on words, they all exist within the Hebrew language. So why would we be given a name or a phrase that we have no idea what it means? So the rabbis are going to be split. It's a word that we just don't understand, end of story. Or no, obviously it's connected to Hebrew. God would never give us words in the Torah that we couldn't interpret properly. So our story begins, and I'll let you take this one as well, Gloria, because it's so short. The second source is an Aramaic, the first complete Aramaic and perhaps the first ever Aramaic translation of the Torah. Just like today we have English translations, German, French, French or Spanish, so too in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the most popular language among the Israelites was Aramaic. So this guy Onkelos, who was actually a convert to Judaism, there's a lot of mystery about who he was and what his story was, but he was a convert to Judaism, translated the entire Torah. And this is how he translated it. This is the English translation of his Aramaic translation. So Gloria, go ahead. Source number 2.
And Paro called Joseph by the name, the man to whom mysteries are revealed.
Excellent. So he translates it in this Aramaic Gavra, which means a man. De mitamran galyan le. Galyan is to reveal it to him. So the man, de mitamran, it must be these mysteries. So the man who reveals mysteries. Now, in context, the fact that Paro loved Yosef because he interpreted his mysterious dreams, to call him the dream interpreter makes perfect sense. But the question is, how do we know that that is what it means? So what Onkelos is doing, and many rabbis will continue in that, is say that this word tzafnat paneach is indeed from Hebrew. How did they figure that out? So source number 3, Leonard, is actually, it's from a contemporary source, the Israel Institute of Biblical Studies, but they explain very well how they got from this seemingly unidentifiable phrase to modern Hebrew. So go ahead, Leonard, source number 3.
The name Zaphanat Paneach that was given to Joseph can be derived from the Hebrew roots Zaphat, Isaphan, and Paneach. Sephan means to hide, treasure, or store up. We find this word in Psalms 119. Why, thy word have I hid in mine heart, which in Hebrew is Belbi Isaphanti. Paneach means to decipher, solve, decode, interpret.
Excellent, thank you. So it looks like, based on what they're saying, that the word paneach does kind of have a cognate, a similar word in Hebrew, so that's possible. But the word safanat does sound like a Hebrew word. In fact, on the Pesach Seder, one of the last things we do is safun, before we do Birkat Hamazon, and it means hidden away, and that's when the afikomen is hid, and then we try and find it. So it's not crazy to make that jump. But again, the word safun and safanat are not exactly the same. And more importantly, in Hebrew grammar, the grammar that's consistent throughout the entire Torah, there's no form that is known where the Hebrew word tzafun, hidden, would ever be in that tzafanat. And even the word paneach, even though it's a little bit closer, at least what they're saying here, it's still a little bit of a stretch. But let's say that we give, fine, we'll give you the second word. The second word seems to exist in Hebrew. The first one, I don't know so much. However, this is what the rabbis, and certainly Onkelos, one of the earliest, and not just translation, but interpretation of the Torah. Because when he translated, he often made assumptions about what things meant. So one of the first commentaries on the Torah said it's a Hebrew word meaning revealer of mystery. So Rashi takes that similar direction. And Leonard, you can take that source 4 as well, please. You don't have to read the Hebrew, it's just tzafanat paneach. Go ahead.
Explainer of hidden things. There is no other example in scripture of the word.
So that's interesting. He agrees with this Targum, this translation by Onkelos, that it means one who reveals mystery or explains hidden things. Yet he also recognizes that this is a hapax legamemnon. There's no other word like this in the Torah. So there's nothing to compare it to. So Rashi admits there's not really a lot of evidence to prove what it means, but the tradition that he has passed down is it means the one who reveals secrets. And again, it makes sense that Paro would have called him that. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Now, the Ramban, who I love so much, who lived after the time of Rashi, and the great grammarian Ibn Ezra, is able to respond to them all. So he first starts by responding to Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, but then he's going to bring in some of the other ideas that had been proposed before his time to take them to task, and then kind of share what he thinks the proper understanding is.
Rabbi Abraham van Ezra said, if this is an Egyptian word, we do not know its meaning. But according to the opinion of earlier scholars who say that it means explainer of secrets and is a Hebrew expression, it's possible that Pharaoh called him by this honorable name in accordance with the language of Joseph's country, after he asked him, or the king may have known the language of Canaan, was adjacent to Egypt, and his purport is that he reveals concealed matters. So also did Pharaoh's daughter named Moses, her teacher, in the language of his people. For out of the water, Menamishihu, I pulled him. Now, do not wonder why Egyptian writers called Moses Munoz, for they changed the name into the language they understood or used, as the Targum Onkelos does in some cases, as for example between Kadesh and Shur, which he translated as between Rechem and Shigra, and similarly with many names. And in some places, Onkelos does not change them at all, just as in the case of Sichon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, and many others like them. This is because in these times they were called thus in Aramaic.
Excellent. Thank you, Isabel. So there's a few things going on here. So first, he brings in Ibn Ezra, who suggests that the name is indeed Egyptian, and we simply don't know what it means. We'll actually come back to that, but in their time, they didn't speak Coptic Egyptian. But he also suggests maybe it is in Hebrew. It wouldn't be so crazy. Paro obviously knew that Yosef was an Israelite, so perhaps he gave him a word in a language that he understood. But then Ramban turns around again and says, but we do have names of famous people in the Torah given Egyptian names. The name of Moshe is clearly somehow connected to the Egyptian name. It's an Egyptian name. The rabbis or the Torah does kind of a play on it, but clearly he's also given like Tutmos, like he is given an Egyptian name. Then he moves on to this last section, which is talking about consistency in Onkelos between when he does identify someone by their ancient Egyptian name, their Aramaic name, Hebrew, etc., like that. But Ramban basically says we're not 100% sure, but it's not crazy to accept both possibilities. He validates that it could be Egyptian, and we may just not know what it is, and it could be Israelite, Hebrew, and it's just translated for the sake of Yosef. And that basically covers the classical rabbinic opinions, which is it's Hebrew and it means explain our secrets, or it's Egyptian and we have no idea what it means. Now, one other rabbinic, idea here takes a totally different tack, which is more of a drash, more of a hello, Lynn, Hanukkah Sameach, more of a interpretive idea. And Susan, did you have a question, Susan?
No,
Oh,
no, I
excellent.
was
Well,
just, you said Lynn came on, so I was trying to get pictures of everybody.
oh, no worries. Well, Susan, I would love for you to read, if you could read source
Okay.
number 6. And this is actually, this source is really interesting because it is a compilation of dozens of rabbis known as the Tosafot that were the descendants, or at least the academic descendants of Rashi and his grandsons, did commentaries on the Talmud. And in their different academies in France and Germany and everything like that, they were Ashkenazim, someone came along in the 12th, 13th century and compiled them all together. So it's a really cool commentary that represents so much knowledge. So they interpret it completely differently than what we've seen before. And the reality is the English translation doesn't make so much sense, but we'll look at the Hebrew afterwards. So Susan, go ahead, source number 6.
Okay, Sahanot Panaim, this name is an acronym describing a person who is steadfast in the presence of strong urges to satisfy his libido through sleeping with partners legally forbidden to him. Potiphar has had no reason to believe that Joseph could not withstand such temptation. Paro wanted the world to know that Joseph had been completely innocent of any accusation.
So there's so much going on here about when Paro publicly introduces Yosef to the world and kind of I picked him because he can control himself. But the Hebrew, it comes out more clearly because it says it's a notari kon, an acronym, and it has the sentence, Tzaddik, a righteous person, Pipet, held himself back, neged tavato, against his desires. And if you take the first letters, Tzadi, Pe, Nun, Taf, it's Tzafanat. And then this Potiphar's answer, Potiphar ana nafsho chinam, Potiphar, answered to him is Pe Ein Nun Chet, is Paneach. So this is a pretty wild interpretation, and this does not mean that the author of it really thought that's what the name meant. It may have just been, rabbis do this all the time, a word that they either do know or they don't know, and they say it's a combination, it's a combo word, or it's an acronym, etc., like that. But the real takeaway message that this wants to say is, what should we learn from Yosef? What is one of his greatest attributes? If he's being honored in front of the world, what's awesome about him? That he has self-control. That's really the takeaway from it. So again, whether they literally thought that was the understanding of Tzafanat Paneach, that it was an acronym for these two sentences, I don't know about that, but I thought it was kind of cool. This next
Like
source,
gematria.
Very similar idea. And even with gematria, it's not always clear if the rabbis doing it are having fun or if they truly believe there's something baked into the actual words. And we don't know. They could be right. Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next source here, the short one, is from the most recent version of the Encyclopedia Judaica. And they're going to bring in something that we have not seen before. Remember, Ibn Ezra, is quoted by the Ramban, says it's probably Egyptian. We just don't know what it means because they didn't have access to Coptic Egyptian. They didn't speak Egyptian. Well, we do, which led to, go ahead, Lynn, source number 7.
In addition to his generous distribution of honors and titles, Paro and Yosef ride in the chariot of his second in command. Well, men cried before him, Abrech, a word of uncertain meaning. He also gave him an Egyptian name, Tzafnat Paneach, which means the God speaks, he lives. This indeed is in conformity with the known practice of Asiatics and Egyptian service acquiring local names.
Excellent, thank you. So what is so cool to me here, first of all, it's not just technical, it really puts in context what's happening here and fits perfectly with the Torah and with many rabbinic commentaries, which is, what was Paro doing here? Paro was honoring Yosef for the great things that he did do and will do for the nation. So he gives him this honorific, which was a thing that was done in the world. So everything fits perfectly. Now, if it had been Hebrew and meant the one who explains secrets, that would have been a nice, like Native American names are often connected to something core about that person's character. So the interpreter of dreams or of secrets would have fit perfectly with Yosef. However, if this is Egyptian, which it does appear to be, it has a totally different meaning, which is some variation of God speaks or lives. Now that is, as this says, a very common type of name. People are often given, these essentially idolatrous names, although it could be here that Paro was not actually being idolatrous, being the opposite. It wasn't about the interpreting of dreams, because when Paro asked Yosef, how are you able to do this? Yosef's response was, it's not me, it's, who did it, Lynn? Who gave him the power to interpret dreams?
Oh, well.
God. So when Yosef said, I opened my mouth and it's not me speaking, who's speaking? God. So it could be that Paro here is being really frum and actually giving him an Egyptian name that represents the one true God. However, so that actually makes everything fit together beautifully. It does connect with his ability to interpret dreams, because his power comes from the God who speaks, the God who lives, and it connects with his own religion, and it honors him the way that. So it actually, this source and this modern tool that we have access to Egypt makes everything come together beautifully. So if you ask me, standing on one foot, what language is Tafanat Paneh? I would say it's Egyptian. What does it mean? It means God speaks, because God gave Yosef the ability to speak and interpret dreams. And I think what's great is, even though this doesn't agree with all rabbinic opinions, it absolutely is within the rabbinic tradition, and it holds up the Torah, makes it make more sense. And that's a separate question. What if you found a modern tool that makes the Torah not make sense? Well, then we forget about it and we never learned it. But in this case, I like your laughing there, Gloria, but in this case, it works perfectly. But one of the things I said is, I love these cool, modern tools and mysteries in the Torah, but it's always nice to put things in a bigger context and say, what's really the takeaway message about the fact that he is given this title and he does grow into this new personage? And that's this last source here. This is a contemporary source, written as of 2013 by Ephraim Z. Buchwald, who he's actually quite prolific. He is all over the internet and other places, and he writes beautiful Torah, Divrei Torah, etc. So I took a short piece of his, and I will share it now. So jumping in the middle of his piece, Joseph was only 30 years old, 35, what have I done with my life, when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. In preparation for his new appointment as Pharaoh's viceroy, Joseph tours through all of Egypt. Well, it was necessary for Pharaoh to make certain that Joseph was properly dressed for his new exalted position, which the Torah discusses. What was the purpose of giving Joseph a new name? It seems reasonable to conclude that Pharaoh was concerned about a Jewish man serving as the single most powerful figure aside from Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. It is highly likely that Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name as well as an Egyptian wife, Asenat, the son of an idolatrous priest, in order to make him more acceptable to the Egyptian people. So we haven't even talked about why. So actually, we have talked about why he got a name, a way to honor him. So this is a new way to look at it. It wasn't about honoring him. It was about assimilating him. If this guy clearly is the best man for the job, but he's also from a foreign nation, and I don't want to stick a foreigner above all of you, I'll just call him something Egyptian, which that name is never used again, which I think he'll actually say here. Now he's going to propose a few other ideas from the rabbis that we haven't seen before about that specific name, and then he's going to bring it home. The Rashbam, who's the grandson of Rashi, suggests that the origin of the name Tzafanat Paneach may be found in the root of two Hebrew words. So we're back to it being Hebrew. Pa, which means to appear or to give honor, and Noach, from the word to give pleasure. The Ha'emek Davar, which is a contemporary rabbi known as the Netziv, not contemporary in the last 100 years, like 20th century, suggests that Paro gave Yosef this name because he was dazzled by Yosef's exalted inner strength. So this is kind of back to the other understanding, which is a way to honor him, and it's connected to Hebrew. Yosef, who endured many years of degradation and abuse, now rose to incredible heights. Paro was particularly impressed by the fact that Yosef never lost it and adapted to power and authority with ease. Paro quickly realized that Yosef could not have come from common slave origins, but must instead hail from an exalted background and a noble family. Paro names Yosef Tzafanat Paneach because of Yosef's hidden strengths and his rare inner sense of self-esteem and calm. So this is actually a new idea that's being suggested here, that it's not just simply a title because of his position, but it's something to really recognize the true inner greatness of him and his connection with something divine. Continues, and a fascinating observation, Biyoshon cites the Yalkut David, authored by Naftali Hertz Posner, who notes that Paro changed Yosef's name because he did not want his new second in command to bear a name that had an obvious Jewish ring to it. We saw that earlier. Nevertheless, Yosef never personally adopted the new Egyptian name. You know, there's this tradition that the Jews in Mitzrayim, when they were slaves, never lost their Jewish names. This is an example of it. In fact, the name is never again mentioned. Like Yaakov and Yisrael, it goes back and forth. Tzafanat Paneach, we hear it once, that's it. And immediately after Yosef is renamed, scripture notes that Yosef, not Tzafanat Paneach, leaves Pharaoh's presence and passes through the entire land of Egypt. The many names of Yosef reflect his process of growth and transformation. His special gift of experiencing and understanding dreams undergoes a metamorphosis. Once perceived negatively as that dreamer, he is ultimately exalted by Paro as the revealer of the hidden. So while we've seen a lot of sources here that can really hint at what likely that name meant, it's not the most important thing. What's really important is the fact that he earned a new name. He earned esteem in the name in the eyes of his new king and of the people. So for one moment, and all the people who's Tzafanat Paneach, but right before that, he was a slave. And he actually has all these names that he's called a slave, he's a son, he's all these different things. But it's not about the names, it's about what he does. And at the end of the day, he becomes, a great leader, a righteous, good person. And each of us have different names throughout our lives, whether it's, my job before this, I was an associate rabbi. So for a few years, they didn't call me that, they called me Rabbi Dinan, but my official title was associate rabbi. But now I'm the senior rabbi. But who knows, one day it could be something different. Also to some people, and I've talked about this, some people I'm Joel, some people I'm Abba, some people I'm Dinan. But it's not about the names. It's about what I do with them. So the fact that for one moment, Yosef was given this peculiar name that we're not 100% sure what it means, that's not what matters. What matters is that this one man who was thrown into a pit to die became one of the most powerful men in the world because of his faith in God and his desire to do good and help people. And he made mistakes and he learned from them and he grew and became the kind of man that he needed to be to become that leader. So again, the focus is not on names, it's what you do with them. And once in a while, if someone really does good, they will get the honor they deserve. And Yosef clearly got that in spades.